Thanks so much everyone for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists for a leap forward in medicine.
You know, our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
This ecosystem that is being set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network, and it all revolves around you.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Maskell.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Functional Forum. It is October the 5th, and we are here for a special Functional Forum. This is the first time that I've been live since July. I hope you've had a great summer wherever you are in the world, or great winter if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Crazy world we're living in, right? And very interesting that the most important conversations of our lifetime are happening right at the cross section of medicine. And so it's a big moment for me. I had my 40th birthday just last week, and so I'm really excited to do another Functional Forum here this evening. Since the last time we spoke to you, we've had a couple of great forums. In August, we went to just down the road here. Actually, I've been kind of limited about how far I could go to shoot Functional Forums. So just down the road here is Aventis Health, and it was amazing to see what they're doing to bet on community and to bet on functional integrated medicine as they start to roll out their program for health at scale through their series of hospitals. That was super exciting. And then next up, it's been in September, we were able to check out the Functional Medicine Idaho, which was pretty amazing, and what they've got going up there is wonderful. And then also Ollie Health, and Ollie Health is just a really, you know, it's close to my heart because, you know, I live here in Sacramento too. My daughter, by the way, who will be born in February, my second daughter will be a patient there. And, you know, the ability of a clinic to go from being an employee of a hospital for a decade and build in a month, shift that practice into a membership-based pediatric practice is unheard of. I don't know anyone else that's done it. Typically, that kind of transition takes months and months and months. But in COVID, with the Accelerator and the right resources, I guess anything is possible. So that was a super exciting last forum. Over the last months, we've been launching the Practice Accelerator. We've had some great content, but let's get back into what we're going to talk about today, which we're going to talk about stress and chronic disease. And the show tonight comes from highlights from a recent conference. We're back to, you know, looking at content from conferences from around the country. Now, this was one that we attended last year, and I really enjoyed it, which was the symposium for pharmacists run by George Washington University. And I hadn't really considered pharmacists playing a role in the functional medicine revolution until I arrived there and just saw, one, there was a group of pharmacists. There was already over 1,000 functional medicine pharmacists, and that they were the most trusted professional, more than doctors. And three, they actually see their patients much more regularly. So what an incredible opportunity for them to actually play a role in chronic disease. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We've got some amazing speakers lined up. I'm super excited for what's happening. Special shout out for everyone who is listening in the meetups. Obviously, there's not a lot of meetups happening right now because of COVID, but when they come back, we will be coming back strong and facilitating meetups all across the country, all across the world for practitioners. More important than ever for communities to be together, connect, and support each other on this journey. So the first speaker that we're going to have tonight is Jim LaValle. Now, Jim is someone that's never been on the Functional Forum before, which is surprising because this is one of the best known names in functional medicine. He's a big lecturer with the A4M and is very popular. And he did a talk on stress-induced nutrient depletion. Nutrient depletion is basically like the easiest way for pharmacists to get involved. And actually all around the world, I've been speaking now to pharmacy and pharmacy groups who see that it's an obvious role for pharmacists to shift from sort of like a product-based business to a service-based business. And nutrient depletion is a big part of that. Now, obviously, nutrients can be depleted by drugs. So, pharmaceutical induced nutrient depletion. But let's talk for a minute a little bit about stress-induced nutrient depletion. So let's kick off tonight's forum with Dr. Jim LaValle.
So stress-induced nutrient depletions, when you look at these, they alter obviously demand on cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So as we upregulate epinephrine and norepinephrine, that means more tyrosine, more phenylalanine, and that's going to alter our pool of those amino acids. So a lot of other markers, which I'm going to go over, that are increased. Markers of oxidative stress, inflammatory compounds, micronutrient absorption gets changed. And then, of course, stress, increased cortisol output can affect aldosterone. It can change urinary excretion of associated minerals. I see this all the time. That's why I look at standard labs. I mean, I do a lot of work with conventional lab testing. Love to use urinary cortisols and salivary cortisols as well to pick up patterns, but you can't eliminate the fact that, well, where's their cholesterol at? One of the biggest things that raise cholesterol is elevated cortisol. Where's their trace mineral status at? As their cortisol goes up, they deplete magnesium and potassium from the kidneys. It can affect appetite change. One of the biggest things that happens with appetite change is you get, a night eating syndrome. People wake up, hey, I'm not hungry. My stress hormones are high. Just like in the previous discussion, you saw that waking cortisol response being elevated. So somebody goes, I'm just going to hit a cup of coffee. They don't get nutrition. And that means that they start to affect their day. Now, I know another whole topic would be, well, what about time-restricted eating? It's not so simple as to just clump everybody into that time-restricted eating phase in this situation. And so there's the obvious HPA axis effects, which you're going to hear plenty about. I really think that what we're missing is the understanding of the gut-brain connection and how the enterochromaffin cells of the enteric nervous system get upregulated, and it triggers corticotropin-releasing hormone in the periphery, as well as release of mast cells in the periphery. Hence, we see all these folks with inflammatory, situations such as more and more food allergies. And I always say, when people say, when in doubt, start with the gut, not if they have stress. You're going to have very little success at correcting people's guts in the long run if you don't correct for their stress response, because their stress response is intimately tied to their antigen-antibody reaction and their inflammatory response. There's a redistribution of nutrients into organs during stress. There's a change in enzymatic functions and metabolic function during stress. So this marked, heightened, chronic, elevated stress response, which I've seen for 38 years now, it has really incredible, long-lasting and damaging effects to your metabolism and your neuroendocrine immune response. Not to mention gonadotropin-releasing hormone, as it was really well detailed this morning, and growth hormone-releasing hormone, right? When your cortisol is high, your GHRH is downregulated and your GnRH is downregulated. And so when we look at this, the big thing to think about, first of all, there's thyroid and energy issues. As tyrosine goes down, my available thyroid hormone is depleted, so I can't make as much. One of the big things I try to get across to people who are really looking at, I'm looking at thyroid, and all they do is look at free thyroid hormone, free T4 and free T3. I always encourage them to look at total T4 and total T3. Just like a lot of times people make plenty of cortisol, but then they're converting to cortisone. Same thing happens with thyroid, in that I could be making plenty of thyroid hormone, but the free fraction is bound due to my excessive cortisol production and sympathetic tone. That's being done in response to managing heart rate, right? That's why T3 will go down. All you have to do is look at studies in exercised individuals to note, as heart rate goes up, free T3 goes down. And so we can start to say, I'm going to give people T3. And as you know, half the time that happens and people come back and go, wow, I felt really racy. I felt very jittery. What happened? And it's because your body's HPA axis actually turned that down. So just an issue for you to keep in mind. Pancreas and blood sugar issues and insulin issues. This is obvious. Cortisol's up. Insulin goes up. glucose is also kept up in the bloodstream. And so that's a big, big issue, right? Because we've got so many people that are insulin resistant, and it's a pretty complicated event, because as your cortisol goes up and your insulin goes up and your adrenaline is pumping through you, you're reducing the blood flow to the gut. When you reduce blood flow to the gut, you can start to create dysbiosis, release more lipopolysaccharide, which then is, attaches to different organs and tissues and releases a lot of inflammatory downstream proteomic metabolites that start to damage tissues. So literally every aspect of this, as you guys know, I really believe in looking at network biology. So I look at adrenal, thyroid, and pancreas as one energy relationship in your body, and gut, immune, brain as another relationship in your body, and that these networks are really working hand in hand. And we could argue that it's whole body metabolism as well, right? But breaking things down into networks make it easier to describe it to individuals. And obviously, all the downstream effects of the change, and this study where I'm bringing this information from is in this study called The Effects of Psychologic and Environmental Stress on Micronutrient Concentrations in the Body, a review of the evidence. So it changes everything from the gut. Obviously, you get sleep issues due to hyperarousal with the HPA axis. That's what insomnia is described as. Cognitive changes due to dendritic retraction, hippocampal volume changes, mood and anxiety changes, of course, cardiovascular issues, in many cases due to changes in heart rate variability. Obviously, adrenaline, noradrenaline, changing, vessel tensibility, and then creating more renal hypertension. Detox issues are absolutely relevant. That's why I put that slide in previously. As you lose nutrients, you lose your detox capacity. The sex axis issue as well. And then, of course, it's influencing nutrient stores dramatically between the permeability of the gut, along with the increased demand for compounds, raw material for creating stress hormones and neurochemicals and catecholamines. That all kind of creates a stew. And obviously, you all realize that we're supposed to wake up in the morning and be, have our stress response, and at night we're supposed to calm down. I always bring this up because I don't know a lot of people that start to wind down at 9 o'clock. I mean, I know many of us that are the educators try to do this, I guess. We try to get to bed, by 10 so that we allow for our Shen cycle, if you're a believer in Chinese medicine, to kick in and allow for physical repair. And then if you notice, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. is where we get what's called psychological repair. It's really not psychological repair. It's restoration of your neurochemicals. So it's important to understand this. So what happens when people shift this? Well, we're shifting their circadian rhythm of all their hormones, all of their mitochondrial function. Just when you're low in melatonin, for example, or you have a disruption in melatonin release, it affects your insulin signaling pattern from the beta cells for the next 24 hours. So, when you're talking about, you have someone sitting in front of you that's got a sleep problem, and even if you're behind the counter and people are reaching for antihistamines, that tells you they were really stressed out because, histamines being released in the brain as a response to excitotoxicity most of the time. So you've seen this over and over again. I'm not going to bore you with this slide. I just want to emphasize that normal diurnal patterns they just don't affect cortisol. It affects how your sex hormones are released. It affects how your thyroid hormone is released. It actually affects how your insulin is released. And so this normal diurnal rhythm is absolutely, when the HPA axis is off, you can think that all hormones are potentially an issue. I really work hard at trying to reestablish this with individuals. Sometimes it's hard if they've got night shift work. It can be tough. And this is, I think, one of the best papers I'd ever read on free cortisol, because in one slide, it really captured the downward cascading effect of the HPA axis disruption that occurs. As was beautifully described in the previous lecture, the alteration in gonadotropin releasing hormone can alter luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. It affects estradiol and testosterone. To the left, you can see it affects growth hormone releasing hormone and IGF-1. And then you have neurogenesis issues, right? Where elevations in cortisol trigger neuroinflammation, cause damage to the to neurons, and then decreases the neurogenesis, because when cortisol is high centrally, you get a down regulation of progenitor cells and stem cells budding into new neuronal dendritic buds. So you don't get dendritic pruning and you don't get dendritic expansion when you're under chronic stress. Go down one level here and see that, okay, blood pressure goes up, I get it. Insulin action's down. As insulin action's down, insulin goes up. As insulin goes up, I make more catecholamines, renal hypertension. What's the next piece to this? I'm gaining body fat, but what's the outcome? This is what you're dealing with every day when people are walking in, right? When you think about this, whether you're in a community pharmacy or you're a consulting pharmacist, this is what's going on every day for people. They have bone loss, they have muscle mass loss, they're pre-diabetic, they're pre-hypertensive, they've gained weight, they've got cognitive decline, they complain that, hey man, I feel like I'm pushing a thought through jello. They have immunologic compromise. So they're, we saw this better than ever these last 6 months. And then the next result, of course, fractures, frailty, cardiovascular disease, memory loss, and infectious complications. 2013 slide that nailed it as the relationship of free cortisol and its global impact centrally from the brain and its neuronal effect through the global effect of the immune system and, of course, across various systems of the body. This is the concept of metaflammation. Basically your body releases cortisol and inflammatory cytokines in response to an inflammatory state. It could be due to irritant chemicals or pathogens. It could be intrinsic cell defect. You could be epigenetically predisposed to produce more cortisol. But in the end, you get an inflammatory response, and your body either neutralizes that in its response or doesn't. So when you look at this going across the right, when your body does eliminate that cause of the inflammation, it turns off the inflammation. Unfortunately, most people are stuck in an inflammatory cycle, which drops them down below, where we get sarcopenia because of loss of IGF-1 and a decrease in muscle perfusion. You get anemias by upregulating hepcidin and downregulating ferroportin. Ferroportin is what tells your reticuloendothelial system to store ferritin. It also downregulates EPO, so we don't build red blood cells and hemoglobin as well. And then the next effect, of course, is insulin resistance, osteoporosis, neurogenesis issues, reducing cell plasticity, neurogenic growth factors. And then at the end, which is really the decompensation of things, it's where people are at. How many people do you know that say, I'm just tired? I'm tired, I can't seem to generate energy. It's the change in mitochondrial function that occurs as we continue to upregulate inflammation on a chronic basis, or have people with systemically elevated cortisol. And so when you look at this, it's a big, big issue because it's downregulating the NAD to NADH ratio, which means we have less ATP. It also means that we have less PGC1 alpha available, and that means we're not going to be able to make our neurotransmitter receptors or thyroid receptors work as efficiently, because as PGC1 alpha goes down, it's a signal substance for your receptors. How many times have you seen this happen? You give testosterone, you give thyroid hormone, you give estradiol, and it just doesn't seem to hit the mark. Well, if the receptors are downregulated, it's what I've always said. It doesn't matter what your blood levels are or something. Well, it does to a certain extent, right? We do know that. But what really matters is, are the receptors functioning?
All right, so we are starting you off with a bit of Jim LaValle, who is, for very good reason, a great educator in the space and well liked. And that was a great start to really understand what's going on with stress and what nutrients are being depleted. And, in the case of stress, I mean, who isn't seeing patients with stress? Which patients aren't stressed? Who doesn't have stress in COVID? you know, a few years ago when I was going to interview Dr. George Slavich at the UCLA stress lab, you know, they put together a whole stress intake because there were so many different types of stress that people came across in different lives. And surely COVID has opened up all new different types of stress too. So I'm sure wherever you're practicing in the world right now, this is hyper relevant. So one of the reasons why we partnered with the Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center here at the Functional Forum is because we realized, like, okay, it's one thing to learn about something here on the Functional Forum. It's another thing to actually go back to the practice and start to execute protocols and actually help people with this stuff, right? There's an implementation gap that needs to be filled. And Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center has been our sponsor for the last year and a half and is our long-term sponsor because they've created tools that facilitate just this. So on the conversation of stress, they have the SOS Stress Recovery Program. And the goal is to deepen your clinical learning on this topic, right? Is to provide educational resources to help you translate functional medicine concepts to your patients. It's one thing to learn about, it's another thing to translate it. And how do you translate it? Just via your voice in an appointment? It's unbelievably inefficient, right? We need much more efficient ways to translate it. And also to provide a framework and assets to help you market this program to existing and prospective patients. So one of the key assets they have is this book that was made by Dr. Tom Williams. And for those of you who haven't been around that long, like, Dr. Williams really played an important role in shifting the conversation about stress and the HPA axis. I mean, a lot of people were talking about things like adrenal fatigue, you know, years ago, and still I hear people talk about it. Like, read this book. It's HPA axis dysfunction. Adrenal fatigue is not really a thing. And we need to be clinically accurate. And Chris Kresser talked about this on the Functional Forum in 2016. So, you know, in this updated edition that's just coming out right now, this is the standard. There's more info on stress-related thyroid dysfunction. There's stuff on stress and memory. There's stuff on the endocannabinoid system and its effect on stress signaling. And then there's an expanded section on nutrients affecting stress signaling. So this is the Bible of this topic. And Tom Williams is awesome. That's why we had him on the podcast and on the forum a couple times over the last year, because this is his jam. And I know a lot of people have enjoyed learning from Tom over the years. So they also have this in-practice guide that's super interesting. It's got protocols, complete case studies, you know, these SOS kit that has all of these details in here. Like, this is basically a complete clinical implementation resource kit. If you're finding that you need help in communicating what you're doing to your patients, they've created all of this already. And as part of it is included the group visit toolkit. And, you know, in my book, I talked about particularly this stress group visit, which I mentioned this woman called Donna Nauman, who's a nurse practitioner. And some of the most incredible results happened during this stress group visit that she made. She told this one story of the woman who she made come to this group visit rather than just giving her more Xanax, and the transformation it had on her and her whole family, not with a bit of a fight, but the empathy that was shown there is really transformational. So there's all these cool stuff in the group visit. You got flyers, you've got all those things. And this is new. I want to just share this. So this is something that we've been working to co-create. This is the SOS Recovery Program onboarding. So ultimately, if you are interested in finding out more about having a stress program in your office, we have this onboarding program at the Lifestyle Matrix where if you go through this digital onboarding, you get a 5-module functional medicine course on stress, learning videos, homework, and execution plans to help you go step by step into executing this type of practice. So look, if you're interested in finding out more about it, you can go to lifestylematrix.com/SOS-program. We're super grateful to Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center for their ongoing sponsorship of the forum. And this is how, like, this whole thing is on stress-induced on stress and chronic disease, right? You don't have to be a pharmacist to get it. This is everyone, everywhere is dealing with this. If we need to take it from, you know, a little bit of communication to a lot of communication, how to create a whole program in your practice, this is where it's at. All right, next. How do we measure stress? This is something that Tom Williams was really on the cutting edge of. And so we're super excited to have Dr. Carrie Jones back on the Functional Forum. She is a wonderful educator. She is also the medical director of Dutch Test. Dutch Test is kind of integrated into some of the SOS resources in the Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center. We're big fans of the Dutch Test, and here's Dr. Carrie Jones.
So what can labs tell us about cortisol? They can tell us the up and down pattern, which is called the diurnal pattern. We can talk a lot about the stress response resiliency, which is the cortisol awakening response, your total production of cortisol, and your metabolic preference. Do you like cortisol or do you like cortisone? Do you like active or do you like inactive? And what's great is that if you're seeing some of this stuff for the first time, just be aware that all of this is addressable. I don't even know if that's a word, but this is all very addressable. So once you can dial in on these things like, oh, it's a production problem, let's support the brain and the mitochondria and nutrients and what have you, or oh, it's a deactivation problem, or it's an overactivation problem. Okay, let's address that. And so that's a really nice way to use these 4 checkboxes to hone in on that person. So with traditional endocrinology, what do we get, right? We get, well, if it's not Cushing's and it's not Addison's, then you're normal. You're normal. Like I get that you're tired and you have insomnia and you're gaining weight and your hair's falling out and you're not ovulating. I get that, but it's not Cushing's and it's not Addison's, so you must be normal. But really what I'd like to say is that when it comes to this, we get into more of like a functional look, and that's where traditional testing is serum. So traditional diagnosis is Addison's and Cushing's. Traditional testing is serum. It's a single blood draw, very, they can just do it at their doctor's office. Although not a lot of people want to get a blood draw right now. Not many people are really excited to go into a hospital or a lab to get their blood drawn. When you do a serum cortisol, the results are a combination of bound and unbound. Unbound means free cortisol, which is not that helpful. So if you got your blood drawn for cortisol this morning and you got your result was 10, you don't know if that's 9 bound up and 1 free, or 9 free and 1 bound up. So that's the tricky part, because you want to know, like, well, how much is active and how much am I making? So there's no value for free cortisol. There's no cortisone or metabolites or any kind of rhythm, because nobody wants to get their blood drawn 4, 5, 6 times during the day. So we propose a functional endocrinology model, which is, okay, got it. We'll make sure it's not Addison's. We'll make sure it's not Cushing's. We'll do our due diligence. But in between there, when somebody comes in and they don't feel great, like maybe they're just at one end of the spectrum or the other. They're more in the orange or the red on the low side, or the orange or the red on the high side. So it's more of this like functional sliding scale when it comes to their cortisol, and that's where we get into functional testing to better depict this. So along came salivary and urinary testing for cortisol. Now, this allowed for multiple collections in the day and at-home data. A lot of people right now in 2020, like I said, they don't want to go into a hospital. They don't want to go into a lab. And so having the ability to have easy at-home testing is really appealing to a lot of people right now, making it pretty convenient. So salivary cortisol became really popular because you could do it throughout the day and get that free cortisol. You could see your full circadian rhythm. You could test your cortisol awakening response. When you do it, there's 2 different ways to do saliva testing. You can free flow spit into a tube, or you can use salivate swabs, which are basically kind of like rolled up cotton swabs that you pop into your mouth and sort of suck on or chew on and then spit back into the tube. So ideally, the salivate swabs are better, especially for the cortisol awakening response, because it's a quicker collection as opposed to having to passively drool into a tube and wait to produce saliva. But you do have either option. The downside, though, you don't get cortisone, you don't get the metabolites, and unfortunately, despite the fact that your salivary gland has a lot of 11 beta HSD in it, a lot of companies don't include that marker as part of their testing. So saliva is great for free cortisol, great for the cortisol awakening response, great for at-home testing, but missing a few things. Then came urinary cortisol testing. Now you can do 24-hour urinary cortisol testing, which misses the circadian rhythm. but gives you everything, the cortisone, the cortisol, the metabolites, what have you. And then you have dried urinary cortisol, which is where you urinate, kind of like saliva, where you collect through the day. You urinate on pieces of filter paper throughout the day. So you do get the multi-point circadian rhythm as free cortisol and cortisone. So you have both options, but the dried does give you the circadian rhythm. Both the 24-hour and the dried will give you cortisol and cortisone metabolites, and they will give you the 11-beta HSD preference. Unfortunately, though, because of the quickness of how you have to test a cortisol awakening response, urinary testing, whether it's 24-hour or dried, is not good for the cortisol awakening response. And I'll show you why in just a second. We want to use saliva for that. So having said that, what a lot of practitioners are starting to do is do some sort of combination. So they're doing urinary testing in combination with saliva so that they get the cortisol awakening response, they get that circadian rhythm through the day, they get the cortisol metabolites, and they get that 11-beta HSD. And now your 4 check boxes have been checked, and you can properly address the patient based on their individual results, which is really nice. So a typical 4-point response, if you're new to how cortisol works, kind of looks like this. So in this example, the gray shaded area is where you want to be, and the red line with the red dots is a typical normal person. So on waking, the cortisol is low, and then it will gradually increase. And some companies test 2 hours later, some companies test around lunch. Just depends which company. And then they'll test in the afternoon or around dinner, and then they'll do it again at night. And again, you can see it rises up like a mountain and then comes back down. This is your normal circadian rhythm, ideally, that you're following. So the 4-point collection is a great starting point. You get your rhythm, you can include metabolites, you can include your 11-beta HSD, and you can include your cortisone. And this is a pretty standard way of testing for a lot of people and trying to get that rhythm. You're trying to hit that rhythm with your patients, with your clients. But then to take it one extra step, when you want to get a little more microscopic into how your patients are functioning, especially in the morning, we add in the cortisol awakening response. And how is the cortisol awakening response different? Why do you care about it? Well, we've shortened it to the CAR because cortisol awakening response is a mouthful, and it's used as one marker to determine resilience and flexibility. And let me tell you, in 2020, resilience is probably the word. If it's not new normal, it's resiliency that you hear over and over and over again, and it's with good reason. And the CAR is one of the things in the human body that helps us be more resilient. And by testing the CAR, we can test some of our resilience. It's one of the ways we can test our resilience. So it has been repeatedly been suggested that the CAR could be a result of the anticipated demands of the upcoming day, stress anticipation, and could support coping with daily life stress. So by knowing your CAR, by knowing my CAR, by knowing the CAR of my client or patient, I can get a really good insight into how they're really doing. Because sometimes you ask somebody how they're doing and they're like, I'm fine, it's fine, I'm fine, it's all fine. And then you look at your labs and you're like, wow, you're not fine. We need to work on this because we don't want you to start to develop comorbidities. So the reason that I test the CAR, the reason that I love the CAR is because it influences so much. The little action of the cortisol awakening response in the morning is amazing. It affects our alertness. Now, a common cheater method that I will do is I will ask you, how long does it take you to become alert in the morning? And if you tell me it takes you 2 hours and 2 cups of coffee, I know that your cortisol awakening response is not that healthy, because a normal CAR kicks in about 20 to 30 minutes after you open your eyes. In 20 to 30 minutes, you should switch from conscious to alert. And if you're thinking to yourself right now, yeah, nope, then you are probably struggling with some CAR issues. Now, other people might say, oh, I wake up and I'm immediately to a 10. I am on fire. I am either anxious or hypervigilant or on the go or type A or whatever it is, I'm maxed out as soon as I wake up in the morning. That is also, it's not a healthy CAR response either. We don't want to go either way. This is like Goldilocks. We want it to be just right. Our CAR influences our energy levels, our stress response, our levels of feeling stressed out. It deals with our blood sugar management. A healthy rise in the morning of cortisol is because partly because we have been fasting all night long. So the body will increase cortisol so that you can get some glucose in your system, because for a lot of people, you don't eat breakfast in the first 20 or 30 minutes. And for a lot of people, you don't eat food for hours. And it's cortisol's job to manage that. The health of your car can actually impact autoimmune development and progression. You have in your thymus gland, not thyroid, but thymus gland, you have thymocytes, so thymus gland cells, and the thymocytes help your immune system to, it's kind of like a checks and balances for autoimmune. So if your T cells and your immune system get created, and when they differentiate, when they mature, when they graduate from T cell school, your body first has to check them to make sure they're not autoimmune. Your body is smart like that. So it runs them through the thymus gland and says, let's double check to make sure that you're not an autoimmune T cell that we created by accident. And if you fail the test, you have to get destroyed. Unfortunately. Well, fortunately, right? We don't want autoimmune. Sad for that cell though. So in my head, it gets pulled aside and then it has to get destroyed. And one of the triggers, one of the instigators to get apoptosis to happen is that cortisol awakening response. It's one of the like, as soon as your car goes up, it triggers apoptosis to these failed T cells. If you don't have a healthy rise of cortisol in the morning, if you're more of a flat person, maybe you go down, you could potentially allow these failed cells to slip out and sneak out into circulation. And we don't want that. Cortisol awakening response impacts inflammation and infection in the morning, especially. So if you wake up in pain, you wake up and all your joints hurt, but then, 20 to 30 minutes, 40 minutes, you're feeling a lot better. It's because your cortisol's kicked in. Your cortisol's helping reduce your inflammation. But if you don't, it's possible you have a lower flat car. Memory and recall, this is where that healthy cortisol awakening response is, where tomorrow, if you're trying to reflect back on what I said or what Tom said or what anyone said today, you may not have the healthiest of cars. And then cancer outcome again. So how does it work? I keep talking about it. How does it work? So as awakening gets closer, your pituitary gland is trying to release ACTH. So basically, it's like a little kid on Christmas. It's your brain is trying to talk to your adrenals, and they're going, now? Can you make cortisol now? Now? Can we make cortisol now? Now? And the adrenals are like, no, not yet, not yet. He or she hasn't opened their eyes yet. They're still asleep, like not yet. So there's this blunting. But as soon as you open your eyes and as soon as light comes into your eyes, then it's go time. Then the adrenals go now, and the blunting releases. The ACTH is able to bind onto the adrenal gland strongly, and you produce a sharp rise in cortisol. At least a 50% increase in about 30 minutes, causing you to move from conscious to alert. Then you have a sort of like a rebound. So then you gradually decline, right? So you go up to a point and then gradually decline through the rest of the day. So you're nice and low at night so that you can fall asleep and stay asleep. But you'll see I have underlined and bolded is where it says light enters the SCN, suprachiasmatic nucleus in your brain. Light is the key trigger here. Light, not ashwagandha, not magnesium, not thyroid medication. It's light that triggers this whole cascade. So let's keep that in mind. So when you collect the cortisol awakening response, it's quick. So in whatever company you use, you're going to collect your saliva immediately on waking. Then 30 minutes later, because of course it's supposed to rise in about 30 minutes and hit its peak. Then 60 minutes after that, after waking, and then around dinner and then before bed. And then for a lot of companies, a lot of people struggle with insomnia, so they give you a tube or a saliva swab to do in the middle of the night if you happen to wake up. So you can see it's waking 30, and then around dinner and before bed. So that's why it's really difficult to get a blood draw there. And that's why it's sort of difficult to, urinate on a strip of paper or in a cup there, because it's waking 30. It's much easier to pop a cotton salivate swab in your mouth and just get it done. We still want that dinner and bedtime sample, though, when you're evaluating a cortisol awakening response, because I want to know your entire circadian rhythm. I want to know why you're not sleeping. I want to know why you're anxious at night. I want to know why you're so tired in the afternoon. I still want to know all of those things. this is what the whole curve looks like. Now you would think to yourself, well, that gray area is what we saw earlier, and it looks very, very similar. It is very similar, but this is zoomed in. So this, as you can see along the bottom, waking 30, 60. So it's a very, very quick up and down within 60 minutes, and then it continues to decline for the rest of the day. This is what a healthy cortisol awakening response looks like. So it should look like a nice mountain. It should not look like, you know, a blunted hill. It should not look like a flat plains. It should not go straight up like a rocket. This is what it should look like, ideally. It's also important to note when you're dealing with cortisol that your morning cortisol, even no matter what, should be higher than your afternoon and your bed sample. So no matter what, you should have higher cortisol in the morning, or higher physiologically, so higher normally. But if you test yours, or you test your, you know, client or patient, and you see their waking is below the afternoon point, like that can incite a lot of comorbidities and can be concerning. So make sure that when you're evaluating, you want the morning point, the waking point, at least above the afternoon point and the night point. That's what you're going for.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Carrie Jones. Great as ever. And talking about the awakening response, you know, such a critical conversation. And, you know, one of the things that she mentioned there, obviously, is that 2020 was the year of resilience. And this is a marker of resilience. One of the consistent themes that we've tried to talk about this year has been this concept of resilience, right back to when we announced it back in February with Dr. Bland at the at Bastyr University. And it's been super critical that, you know, we all understand what resilience is and that we help our patients to build resilience. It's been obviously a huge lesson in that through COVID on the other side. And what a great marker of resilience. And I think that cortisol awakening response has really sort of morphed into one of the standards in functional medicine for assessing these types of areas. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about how you've been using it in practice and how to work it. But thank you, Dr. Carrie Jones. That was a really insightful little piece there. All right, so for our last segment tonight, we have Melody Hartzler. She is a pharmacist, and she has been centrally involved in the functional pharmacy movement, actually working on programs to create CME, or continuing education for pharmacists. Sometimes the CE that's created by other education organizations doesn't fit for pharmacists. So she's been centrally involved, and we're super excited to welcome her for her Functional Forum debut. We met last year at the conference. We recorded an interview that we didn't end up using, but she's actually just going to talk about the protocols. So now let's get into it. We know how to test for it. We know what's going on from Jim at the beginning physiologically. How do we start to execute on these protocols? Here is Melody Hartzler talking about it. And this is also from the George Washington Symposium.
So the next part we're going to talk about is protocols. So Dr. Moat already took us through some great protocols addressing some of the lifestyle modifications, even starting to talk about some of the nutrients. So this is a great diagram from the standard roadmap series that talks about the sort of the different points for addressing and the different strategies for addressing the HPA axis dysfunction. So we've got you know, maintaining that appropriate response to stressors, working on the glycemic dysregulation, which is one of the main things we're going to talk about for those 4 key stressors. So we've got perceived stressors, the inflammation, and the circadian signals. So all of those things are things we're going to talk about here. We're also going to, we talked already about some of the progesterone effects, the neurotransmitter effects, and then we're going to talk a little bit about adaptogens and some of the nutrients that we can use for adrenal support. And a little bit about, you know, how that tissue modulation, really the, you know, anti-inflammatory, you know, insulin resistance component really helps address the stress piece as well. And so again, the key stressors, one of the key stressors is that glycemic dysregulation. So some of our, you know, interventions can really be talking about low glycemic diets to our patients. You know, Mediterranean diet with a low glycemic, you know, approach is definitely, I mean, it's naturally low glycemic, although, you know, some of our patients will be like, well, you want me to eat bread? There's bread in the, you know, and you don't necessarily have to eat bread on the Mediterranean diet. You can still take the Mediterranean diet template, and but whole grains are part of that template if people tolerate them. them. But otherwise, looking at, they focus on the low glycemic fruits and things like that, and lots of good dietary fibers and polyphenols in that diet. And the nutrient support piece, like potentially there's supplementation that might help with glycemic regulation, which we'll talk about a few of those things. And then we've already hit on the meal timing, so I don't think I need to talk too much else about that. There are, some nutrients like fibers and things that the timing of taking the supplement with the meal can also be helpful for the glycemic load. For example, partially hydrolyzed guar gum taken, before a meal shows a decrease in glucose afterwards. So, supplementing with those prebiotic fibers prior to meals may also be helpful. So I talk about that here, nutrients to consider. So there's also other fibers listed there as well. Water-soluble dietary fiber from the konjac root. And then some of the other nutrients, the alpha-linolenic acid, the flax seeds are generous sources of omega-3s that are alpha-linolenic acid. And they also have contributing some additional protein and other micronutrients as well. So adding some flaxseed to the smoothies, to even baked good if someone is eating those, or just, adding it to, different meals is great. Getting it from a food source. If you can't get it from a food source, then, considering it, inside some of these fiber blends that have some more whole food based fibers. And then we also have the alpha lipoic acid. So alpha lipoic acid is actually an antioxidant that affects blood sugar metabolism. It actually also has data for peripheral neuropathy. So sometimes we can target two things with that nutrient. Generally about 600 milligrams of that is appropriate. So in peripheral neuropathy, they studied like 600, 1200, and 1800. And over the course of the 4 weeks, everybody had the same effect, and also placebo. So it was better. So basically the 600 is enough in most cases for those patients. And then other nutrients to consider that help with glycemic regulation. Chromium is a critical element, and it helps the glucose to be taken up into the cells to be used for energy. And then the vandyl sulfate also stimulates glucose uptake within the cells and really helps the body to be more efficient and balance the blood sugar. Again, that insulin sensitivity, addressing insulin sensitivity. One of my favorites is berberine. So berberine does a lot of things. It's an insulin sensitizer, works in the liver. It also is a natural PCSK9 inhibitor. I always want to mix that acronym up, but so it can have some LDL reduction as well with it, which is really cool. And part of the way it works is also through modulating the gut microbiome. So you'll recognize that berberine is sometimes used in our 5R protocols occasionally, and we typically use it at lower doses when we're addressing gut dysfunction. And for getting the metabolic effects of berberine, we really need to be more in the 500 to probably more closer to 500 twice a day, 1,000 milligrams a day to get the effect there. It actually has some similar effects to metformin as far as how it influences the microbiome and actually can increase Akkermansia species in the microbiome, just like metformin does. So there are comparison studies of berberine versus metformin showing similar results. There's not a lot of evidence that berberine plus metformin can be helpful. So that's a hard, decision, based on what we know from the evidence. Is it going to be helpful for someone already taking metformin? But, it could be worth, trying and seeing. But yeah, most people tolerate it fairly well. Sometimes there's some GI upset. In the clinical trials, constipation is the most common side effect there. And you can always back off on the dose if constipation occurs, or increase the fiber content as well. And then the other one is zinc. So I love using zinc, especially right now. We talk about zinc and the immune function a lot, but it also helps to play a role in insulin formation, as well as the studies have shown that it decreases glucose, also can improve HOMO-IR and CRP. So if you think about, a micronutrient that affects your inflammation and your overall insulin resistance, so that's why so many functional medicine practitioners really do look at that zinc level to see where it is. There's multiple studies of patients with pre-diabetes or that impaired glucose tolerance that actually are deficient in vitamin or deficient in zinc, and they give the patient zinc, and the patients, and in the placebo-controlled ones, the patients that got zinc had less risk of developing full-blown diabetes compared to those who did not get zinc. So it's definitely something to consider. There's multiple, potential benefits for zinc, not only in the glycemic regulation, but also the effects that it has on the immune function. So when we talk about those key stressors, so the glycemic piece, could be a whole nother day of a symposium. So we just hit on really the high points there. And then we're also going to hit on the high points of inflammation here. So as far as, inflammation goes, certainly diet plays a huge role. You can help, with the glycemic piece and the inflammation piece by implementing that Mediterranean style diet, or even doing, an elimination diet, taking out some of those potential stressors to the body, especially if you've got someone that is coming in with a lot of the inflammatory symptoms, a lot of the allergy symptoms, food intolerances. That's where that elimination diet might make more sense up front, and then maybe moving into a Mediterranean diet after they address, maybe potentially figuring out what their key stressors from a dietary impact are. And then the dysbiosis and food intolerances plays a huge role in the inflammation. I have a patient that I'm seeing in my private practice right now that has, dysbiosis. She's got, had yeast and other pathogens show up on her GI map. And then there's also, she did some antimicrobial work with another practitioner, but she's still having a lot of symptoms. We did a Sibo test, and it was an interesting result on there that suggests hydrogen sulfide, Sibo, even though that's not exactly what they're testing on there. But all in all, she's got, elevated CRP, she's got elevated ferritin levels, which can indicate inflammation. So what she's got going on in her gut right now, when she came to me, is very much affecting the rest of her body. She's also got elevated glucose, fasting glucose at like 110, and an A1C of 6 right now. And so we really have to address, I'm not going to get anywhere with improving her metabolic syndrome and if I don't address that gut dysbiosis that's occurring first. And so obviously stress, it all, the chicken before the egg sort of situation, but the stress can also contribute to the GI symptoms. The GI symptoms can also increase just the stress by causing inflammation. And so we definitely have to look at both things at the same time, but there's certain people that we might bucket into, okay, where this is our main focus right now, but you also are going to have to address these sleep habits and, other things that are playing into the stress picture to really get your gut under control. Like I think Jim talked about earlier, if we don't address the stress, the gut part won't heal either. So we have to, do these sort of in tandem. And then the chronic low-level inflammation can also, obesity, cardiovascular disease patients can present with that. Other inflammatory disorders, autoimmune things can cause inflammation. So we definitely have to look at like what their inflammatory triggers are and how we're going to improve those. And so the key pieces are really the diet and lifestyle modifications. And there also are some key nutrients that we might consider to use as well. And then when we think about sleep, I feel like we already covered this well with Dr. Moat, so we're not going to spend too much additional time on this because it's pretty much a summary of what he already discussed. And then the sleep piece. So we've talked a lot today about magnesium, which is our last point on this slide. So, considering magnesium support as sort of a first line for sleep can be helpful. Addressing, sort of supporting those neurotransmitters that really help us to get into that, the support melatonin, but also the REM cycle, and potentially considering botanical products if that is something that your patient, needs support with. But like Dr. Moat mentioned, it's great to test these things so we really know, what we're working with. So we have some indication of what's happening with the patient's melatonin before we supplement with melatonin, as well as, figuring out what their cortisol levels are. So if we look at the different anxiolytic or sedative botanicals, there's a list here. We have the L-theanine, which is actually in green or black tea. I don't know about you, but some people, there's caffeine in green tea as well. So sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm going to have some green tea that'll help me feel awake. But actually green tea does not help me feel awake because of this property of it. And so, I think that's something to consider for patients. So maybe a decaffeinated green tea that would still have the L-theanine might be something they could try before bed if they wanted to use a more food-based approach. And then, you know, it also comes in supplement form in many of these combination products. With the list here, you know, definitely things that have been used for a long time, like German chamomile, and some of these other passion flower extracts, valerian root. You know, some people are using the essential oil version and the, you know, extract version. Multiple different things to look at as far as, you know, how we can use alternative medicine and use plants to help patients get their that sedative effect and anxiolytic effect. And then as far as the neurotransmitter support, the purpose of this, you know, as far as we really want to support mood, the memory, the concentration for the patient. This might also be helpful in patients that have had ADHD or other addictive disorders. So some of these nutrients that we're going to talk about, you know, supporting serotonin, the GABA, dopamine or epi, and helping really that optimum mood and cognitive function is really key for some of the folks that are, especially with a lower cortisol in the afternoon, and making sure that they have, you know, the right concentration for their jobs or, you know, what they might be doing. So some of those things that we could use potentially would be like your gamma aminoburic acid, and then the L-tryptophan, or 5-HTP. So I know our nurse practitioner in our clinic uses this a lot, the 5-HTP in divided doses to help with their neurotransmitter support. And then Dr. Moat's already mentioned a lot about how he uses melatonin in practice, and the taurine was already mentioned earlier today. So I know a lot of us are, you know, giving you similar guidance throughout the day, but I think it's helpful to sort of repeat some of that and talk about it each from every clinician's experience as well. So those are different things that you can check into. And then additional adrenal and cortisol modulation support to consider. So this is one of my favorites besides Berberine. Is a product that is oral lavender oil. So it's actually, you know, we've known lavender in aromatherapy for a long time has that sedative anxiolytic property. This particular formulation, though, is trademarked and actually well studied in trials. So if you go to PubMed and put in that Selexan, you'll find several, probably, you know, more than several clinical trials that actually look at this product. And so they've looked at it, and it's actually first line for anxiety in some European countries. And so basically it's studied versus conventional anxiety treatments have been studied against lorazepam. It's been studied against Prozac and found to be well tolerated, similar results in their scores for their anxiety and those HAM scores. And then also, you know, superior in some cases, depending on the study that you look at for the compared to the conventional medications that we use. And so it has had improvement on quality and duration of sleep. So we've talked about today how much sleep is important, and also improved general mental and physical health without causing unwanted side effects. So the dose is anywhere from 80 to 160 milligrams per day. So 80 is 1 capsule, 160 is 2 capsules. And then the side effects are generally mild. Most of the time, the complaint I hear is they burp lavender. And so I'm not sure how terrible of a side effect that is, but it is probably annoying. I have not experienced that when I have taken it myself, but sometimes the recommendation is if they're doing 2 to back off to 1 to see if they can resolve that, and maybe taking it sort of not putting it like on top of their dinner, so maybe taking it before they eat to see if that can help, so it's not sort of sitting on top of a food bolus there. But otherwise, generally well tolerated and not a lot of side effects. So I have some of the citations here, but definitely check out PubMed if you want more information about the clinical trials that have been done. So I know there's been a lot of mention of adaptogens today, and so a little bit about what an adaptogen is. An adaptogen is basically a substance that increases the resistance of the recipient to a variety of physical, chemical, or biological stressors. So it's a non-specific effect in that if you don't have enough, it can help increase, you know, a particular hormone or have an effect on a receptor. But it's more of that like normalizing effect. And so it can also counteract if there's a lot of stressors that would increase cortisol, it can help counteract that. So I like to think of it, you know, as many of us here today are pharmacists, I like to think of it as a partial agonist. So if we think about a partial agonist, you know, the receptor, it targets the receptor if there's not anything there, but if there's too much there, it's going to help downregulate. And so it can downregulate or upregulate depending on the physiological needs. So these can be really helpful. And you guys are most, familiar probably with ashwagandha. And the dose here is about 300 milligrams twice a day. Some of the other well-studied ones are the eleuthero root or Siberian ginseng. That one is about 750 milligrams 3 times a day. This can be helpful for patients that need more cognitive function support or have overnight jobs. And then rhodiola is actually a really interesting one. So this one, you can actually, at low doses, can be really stimulating, but high doses are really needed to reduce cortisol. So some practitioners will do like some low dose in the morning when the cortisol needs to be higher to help that diurnal rhythm there. And then in the evening, they'll get higher doses. My personal experience with this one was that I took it and I felt the calmest I've ever felt in my life, but I couldn't sleep at all because I was so alert and awake in that calm state. So it wasn't a good option for me to take, to help with those high cortisol levels in the evening because of that, just very aware, awake, that it happened. But I know patients that have taken, the higher doses that sleep fine in that calm state. So definitely something to keep in the toolbox and see, how it works in your practice. And I think that's the thing about a lot of these things is finding the one that you really know works well for your patients, the product works well for your patients. And sometimes it is a little bit of a trial in certain scenarios and learning, the tricks of the trade. Other cortisol modulators, we talked some about phosphatidylserine as well. We generally have to do about 400 to 800 milligrams daily to really get the effect of that. It can be a very calming effect as well, but not quite as calming as the rhodiola as far as not being able to sleep type thing. But phosphatidylserine can be good. There's several products, typically taken in the evening can help as well. And then fish oil actually can be shown maybe related to the anti-inflammatory effect, other mechanisms, but the dose that was studied for this to have cortisol modulation was 7.3 grams per day. So that's a lot of fish oil. And I can't remember off the top of my head if that was grams of fish oil or grams of omega-3 fatty acids. So I will have to get back to people on that if they have questions. But the plant sterols as well, they can increase the DHEA and decrease cortisol. Again, the alpha lipoic acid, the magnesium, the zinc. So you can see how, these agents here, they're modulating cortisol and been shown to do that in clinical studies, but, maybe it's because of the effect on the glucose regulation or some of the other things that we've talked about, particularly with these 3 here at the bottom. And then this chart has all of the nutrients from a vitamin standpoint. So we talk a lot about B vitamins and how they function with the stress response. So there's a little bit of their function regarding stress and also the doses that have been studied for this, helping to modulate the stress response. So B1, B2, I'm sorry, B1, B3, B5, B6, B12, also the folate, and then the vitamin C was already mentioned today as well. And that can actually also, help in the transformation of norepi from dopamine and modulating nitric oxide from catecholamines. So, vitamin C is really important as well. So a lot of, again, this all overlaps. And I think it's important to just make sure our, patients have quality nutrient status. Maybe that means doing micronutrient testing and finding out, what their nutrient status looks like before throwing like everything on them. Maybe they're seeing a really quality multivitamin to make sure that they're getting this if they're not, depleted. If they're depleted, after you do a micronutrient test, they might need some higher doses at the beginning, and then maybe we can back off on those doses later on. With B vitamins, we also know there's a lot of, potential things we need to think about from an MTHFR standpoint and activated Bs, and, that could go down a whole nother day presentation as well. So from a stress reduction standpoint, we've talked a lot today about, the lifestyle modifications that our patients can have as well. So yoga is certainly one that's been well studied and even, well known in the, modern medical community to address stress. Mindfulness practices, relaxation exercises are also, things to consider. I recommend this a lot, even in just my general diabetes practice. They're not full functional medicine consults, they're primary care diabetes, clinical pharmacy. And, when people are coming in stressed, and honestly, everyone is coming in stressed right now. My patients are struggling from a financial standpoint, and they've got, their grandkids that they're schooling because their kids are working, and their parents have no other option besides the grandparents to sit. And, one of my patients this week was on the computer with her grandchildren from 7:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon. And after that, she goes and takes care of her aunt who is dying. And then she comes back and is expected to, clean up the house and everything and get ready for the next day. And she really doesn't have time to take care of herself. So even just incorporating just like the breathing exercises we've talked about, going through, a relaxation meditation, watching one of those YouTube videos that, they can do that guided meditation for 5 or 10 minutes can really make an impact in their stress. And so those are things you can talk about at the pharmacy counter, and they don't have to be part of a huge, functional medicine workup either. Some of the other things are non-pharm cognitive behavioral therapy. So use your referral options, and Dr. Moat may want to add to this as well, but refer to psychology for these things. Find the people in your community that do these different, like the eye movement desensitization reprocessing is really helpful for patients with past trauma, if that trauma causes them stress and anxiety. And so finding your psychologist, your therapist that do those things, and maybe bringing them into your office once a week on a contract, or just letting them use space in your office, something that makes it more accessible to your patients, if that's an option. Heart math is, also something that I think, I want to say one of the other speakers might be talking about, but it's a biofeedback system that helps you to see your heart rate variability, helps walk you through breathing exercises. So it's sort of nice because it's like giving you that feedback to adjust, because otherwise you're just like, okay, I'm sitting here and breathing, and am I, actually getting into that, better heart rate? And so this is sort of giving you that result that the patient wants to see so that they can know how they're doing. And then hypnotherapy is also another thing to consider, also potentially helpful for those trauma patients.
All right, so thank you, Melody Hartzler, for that presentation. There's been a lot of great stuff here tonight on the Functional Forum. What we wanted to do, we've had a lot of like practice management-y, future of medicine kind of stuff over the last couple of months. Want to bring it right back to this evolution of medicine, the way that medicine is adapting to its new environment. One thing is I'm seeing more and more pharmacists who want to be part of it. It's super exciting because they play a key role in the community. And hopefully you've seen today that with stress, functional medicine has a number of solutions that can really help patients, no matter what that stress has caused, no matter how far down the path towards chronic disease they are. So I'm super excited for the next Functional Forum coming to you the night before the election. It'll be the 2nd of November. In the meantime, I'm your host, James Maskell. This has been the Functional Forum. Thanks so much to everyone watching, especially in the meetup groups, and we will see you next time.